Everyone in the valley knew Colt Maddox, but no one tipped their hat to him anymore. Not since that fire, not since the night his partner burned alive in the barn and Colt walked out alone, face blackened with soot, eyes hollow. Something had snapped between him and the rest of the world. No one accused him out loud. Out west, you don't need to. All it took was the way folks looked away, the thick silence when he stepped into the saloon, greetings that never made it past the throat. And no one came around his ranch anymore. Colt never asked them to. Time passed. The fire burned out, but so did the land. Drought crept in like an unwelcome guest. First the green vanished, then the scent of wet earth. And finally, the sound. The wells stopped swallowing rope. All they gave back was air and mud. The cattle, bony and glass-eyed, barely moved. Not from calm, but hunger. Every morning, Colt stood on the porch watching them. Back hunched, hat pulled low over his brow, heart crumbling. He'd choose which animal would live another day. Every choice felt like signing his own death warrant. He didn't own anything anymore. Not even time. He barely slept, ate even less. When he shut his eyes, the crackle of burning wood returned. So did the screams and the smell of burning flesh. It had seeped into his bones. Guilt made no sound, but it weighed heavier than a wagon full of rock. He'd tried selling the ranch. No takers. Asked for help. None came. Not from the pastor, not from the neighbors, not from those who owed him, or those he'd once helped. Nothing. Colt learned that out here, when you survive something the other man didn't, you stop being a person. You become bad luck. Still, he didn't leave. He rebuilt fences no one crossed, checked dry wells, counted livestock he knew were as good as gone. Not out of hope, but habit. Because when your hands stay busy, your mind keeps quiet just a little longer. Then one day, dust-covered and sweat-soaked, he heard again about a spring beyond the eastern hills. Folks said the water there never dried, said it was living land. But they also said no one ever came back. Or if they did, they never spoke of it. Every time that place got mentioned at the saloon, silence followed, like a warning. Colt had heard it all, and stayed quiet just the same. Until his last well spat up thick mud like old blood. That's when he knew he was out of choices. Staying was just a slower kind of surrender, and Colt Maddox, bent in body and scorched in soul, didn't know how to give up. That dawn, he pulled on his boots, slung the rifle over his shoulder out of habit, half-filled a canteen, and saddled the horse. Not for faith, not for salvation. Just inertia. The eastern hills looked taller that day, or maybe the world just weighed more. With every step, the earth changed color. The dust grew finer, the air thicker, and the silence different. Not the brittle silence of desert. This one was dense, like a whisper too afraid to say what was coming. The horse started showing signs, ears back, hooves restless. And just when Colt thought about turning back, he saw them. They weren't running, didn't shout, didn't kick up dust. They stepped out from the rocks like they'd been there all along, waiting. There weren't many of them, but they moved like there were. By the time Colt reached for his rifle, it was too late. A calm voice came from somewhere. "Leave it." And Colt let it drop, knowing there'd be no glory in a fight. One of them nudged the rifle aside with his boot. Another picked up the canteen, gave it a shake, studied it, then poured out a stream of water onto the dry earth. Not all of it, just enough for Colt to see and understand. They didn't laugh, didn't say another word. They tied his hands, not rough, just like tying a man who's already lost. And they made him walk. For hours. Under the sun. Through dust. Every swallow felt like choking on sand. With every step, Colt felt like he was leaving behind more than just his ranch. He was leaving behind the last piece of his name. When they reached the camp, he saw no celebration, no rage, no glory, only hunger, weathered tents, small fires, downcast eyes, silent children. And then he understood. He hadn't walked into enemy territory. He had entered a place that was simply running out of options. And he still didn't know he was about to make a deal that wouldn't just change him, but the entire damned valley. Colt Maddox wasn't surprised there was no violence, no shouting, no humiliation, just steady footsteps, quiet commands, and hands that knew exactly what they were doing. They made him walk with his wrists bound, not with cruelty, but with the calm of men who had already won without firing a shot. They walked for hours beneath a cloudless sky, no shade in sight. Dust filled his nose, his mouth, his eyes. The sun scorched everything. Colt swallowed hard, thinking about the little water left in the canteen, the same water they had spilled right in front of him, like the act itself cut sharper than any knife. When they finally arrived at the camp, it wasn't what he had expected. No war tents, no guards on alert, no chants, just silence. Cracked earth, skin pulled tight over bone, and hollow stairs. Hunger. Exhaustion. And children who didn't run, didn't laugh. They just watched him like he was something they didn't quite understand. Not a threat, not a hope. Just strange. This wasn't enemy ground. It was a corner of the world where hope had gone to sleep long ago, and no one dared to wake it. They brought him to the center of the camp, where an older man, the chief clearly, stood leaning on a dark wooden staff. He wore no feathers, no ornaments, just a face carved by time and the weight of hard decisions. His gaze held no contempt, no curiosity. It was the look of a man sizing something up. Not a man, but a tool, to see if it still had use. "Killing you would be easy," the chief said quietly, without drama. "But it wouldn't help us." Colt didn't answer. He'd already learned that in this place, silence was the only proper kind of courtesy. "Your death won't bring water, won't feed my children, won't stop the soldiers who'll come when others like you don't return," the chief went on, his words slow, unhurried. The old man turned his head slightly toward a woman standing off to the side. She was wrapped in a dark veil, her shoulders held straight, like each step she took hurt more inside than out. No one in the camp looked at her directly. No one approached her. She was another kind of border. "She is my daughter," said the chief, "and she is also a burden this place can no longer carry." Even the air fell silent. What little stirred, the wind, the shadows, seemed to hold its breath. She survived the fire, but ever since, misfortune clings to her like a shadow. No one touches her. No one wants her near. If she stays, someone will kill her, thinking it'll put an end to the curse. There was no anger in his voice, just truth. Hard, dry, like the dirt beneath their boots. "You came alone. You didn't fire a shot. You came thirsty and with guilt in your eyes. That tells me you still understand the weight of things." Colt kept his gaze lowered, not out of fear, but out of respect, knowing that in that moment, even a single word could sound like defiance. "You will take my daughter as your wife," the chief continued, "and as long as she lives under your roof, my people will have a bond with yours. Not peace, maybe, but time. Time." That word, in a land this dry, was heavier than lead. If you hurt her, if you abandon her, if you sell her, The chief added, flat-toned, without raising his voice. "We'll come for you. There won't be a place on this earth where you can hide. But if you care for her, you live." The chief stepped aside. Not with flair, just enough to make space for the choice. Though everyone knew the choice had already been made. Colt understood. This wasn't a proposal. It was a scale, and death was already sitting on one side of it. The ceremony happened as the sun dipped low, when it no longer burned but still shone enough to keep truth in plain sight. There was no music, no vows, just a circle of trampled dirt, a small fire, and a few distant stares, like folks watching a burial. No one asked Colt to swear anything. No one spoke of love or of tomorrow. Only the chief stepped forward and said, "From this day on, she walks with you." The woman did not raise her head, didn't seek his eyes. Colt stepped closer, and with fingers trembling for the first time in years, lifted the veil. The scars were there, marks from the fire on her skin and in her eyes. He didn't flinch, didn't blink. He just said, "Yes." It wasn't a promise, it was a shared sentence. The journey back began without a word. The woman, who had a name, though Colt didn't know it yet, walked behind him, veiled in black. She didn't look back. She didn't waver. She just moved forward with quiet resolve, as if crossing the invisible edge of that camp had been her true farewell. As far as she was concerned, that place no longer existed. Colt, riding his horse, scanned the land with the sharp eyes of a man who knows threats don't always make a sound. He felt her presence a few steps behind. He didn't guide her, didn't rush her. He simply kept the pace, and she followed. Not close, not far, measuring every step like one misplaced stone might shatter the fragile balance of it all. For hours, they traveled under a sky that dimmed slow and heavy. The sun sank quiet, same as them. Shadows grew, but brought no rest. Even as the camp faded behind them, Colt could still feel the weight of all those eyes on his back. Not hateful, not angry. Just a steady reminder that this deal wasn't a locked door. It was a tightrope. One wrong step, and the noose would pull. There was no relief when the ranch came into view. Only a quiet resignation. The certainty that the trial hadn't ended. It had just begun. When they crossed the broken fence and stepped into the dry yard, the cattle raised their heads from habit, not strength. Dust swirled between old posts. Nothing had changed while he was gone. The fences were still down. The ground was still thirsty. Two men came out of the shed, Roy Cutter and Dax Sloan. They weren't friends. They weren't loyal. Just the last ones who hadn't left. The only ones still there because they didn't have better places to be. Both of them froze when they saw the woman dismount. She said nothing. Didn't raise her eyes. Kept her hands folded in front of her, taking up as little space as possible, like she was already waiting to be judged. Roy spoke first, with a crooked grin that wasn't quite mockery, but close. "Didn't know you'd be bringing company, Colt," he said slowly. "Least of all, that kind." Dax spat on the ground without looking up. "We already got enough shit to deal with," he muttered. "Don't need more trouble added on." Colt didn't answer right away. He leaned his rifle against the fence, took off his hat, held it between his hands for a long second, like a man trying to hold on to something solid to keep from saying what shouldn't be said. "She stays," he said at last. "Not a word more, not a word less." The two men glanced at each other. Roy's brow furrowed. "You know what folks in town are going to say?" "They've been saying it," Colt replied. "For years now." Dax took a step forward, lowered his voice. "It ain't just talk, Maddox. These people, they carry curses, and you're already marked." Colt turned his head just slightly. just enough to see that she was hearing every word. She didn't move, didn't defend herself, didn't ask for help. She'd heard it all before. "I'm not going to argue it," Colt said, voice even. "Not with you, not with anyone." Silence followed. Long, the kind that fills itself with truths no one dares to speak. At last, Roy shrugged. "It's your ranch," Roy said in a tone that wasn't approval, nor judgment, "though I don't know for how much longer." "There's still time to decide which side you stand on," Colt replied. No more was said. The men stepped aside. They didn't accept it, but they didn't challenge it either. They knew when a line had been drawn, and they knew crossing it would bring more trouble than it was worth. Colt walked toward the house without looking back. The woman followed, 3 steps behind. She'd heard it all, every doubt, every rejection, and said nothing. She moved inside the kind of silence she knew far too well. And that was the real judgment. By the time dawn broke the next day, before the sun even rose, she was already up. She didn't ask for permission, didn't wait for orders. She swept the dust from the doorway, gathered the rags from the wash, lit the fire with clumsy hands, but hands that meant it. Colt watched from a distance, pretending to check the hinges on the back door or study the empty water barrels. He didn't tell her to stop, didn't thank her, said nothing. And she didn't ask if she was allowed. She just did. In those first days, they barely spoke. Sometimes they shared the same room for hours without trading a word. The silence between them wasn't hostile, but it was brittle, like fine glass, clear, but close to breaking. Distance was measured in footsteps, in glances, in how she always stayed to one side, measuring every move. It wasn't caution. It was memory. Colt didn't try to close that space either. Not once. When he left something for her, he set it on the table. When they passed one another, both lowered their eyes. They slept under the same roof, but in different rooms. No one decided it. It just happened. And yet, through all that silence, small things began to appear. A pair of boots placed near the fire, a clean cup of water set quietly by the door, a piece of cloth folded without reason. Not signs of affection, but of respect. And even if no one outside that ranch could see it, inside those cracked walls, 2 souls that had long stopped expecting anything had begun, without knowing it, to stop being afraid. The days passed like dust slipping through the cracks of an old door, slow, quiet, settling over everything. Inside the ranch, Colt and the woman, whose name he still didn't dare speak, shared a space built from dry routines and sidelong glances. They didn't talk much. Sometimes not at all, but she no longer moved with fear. And he no longer pretended to stay busy to avoid her eyes. It was the smallest gestures that marked the shift. A fresh rag left on the table, firewood chopped without being asked, the way she opened the window just before the sun punished the walls with heat. Inside the house, silence no longer hurt like it used to. It wasn't warm, but it wasn't a threat either. It was coexistence. One morning she hung her veil on the nail beside the door. It wasn't trust. It was exhaustion. One glance was all Colt needed to understand that. And even so, he didn't look at her straight on. Not out of rejection, but respect. He didn't ask for reasons. He knew the scars weren't just on her face. They were in every part of her. Just like his. What neither of them said, they both already knew. Each carried their own fire. Some days, Colt would walk out to the well with the excuse of checking the water, even though he already knew there was barely any left, just to give her space. Other days, she cooked without asking if he'd eat. and he'd eat without asking for it. It was an unspoken agreement. Fragile, but enough to keep breathing. Until the day came to go into town. It wasn't by choice. They were out of salt, out of fence rope, out of grain for the starved animals. Colt had put it off as long as he could, but he knew facing the stairs was as inevitable as the noon sun. They rode out at dawn, when the air hadn't yet begun to burn. She rode in silence, her body stiff, veil drawn tight. Each hoofbeat seemed to weigh more than the last. Colt said nothing, but he could feel her tense at every crossroads, every distant sound. He slowed the pace without comment, as if to give her back a measure of control, as if his silence could be a kind of shelter. When they reached town, the world seemed to shrink. Doors stayed half shut. Conversations broke off midway. Laughter dried up in someone's throat, unable to pretend anymore. There were no insults, not yet. But the air was thick with judgment, the kind that didn't need words. Colt avoided the saloon. He moved fast with his errands. Grain, salt, tools, nothing extra. The tension clung to his neck like dried sweat. They were stepping out of the store when it happened. A man, leaning against a post, half drunk and looser in the tongue than in the mind, looked their way with a crooked grin. "Well now," he drawled, slurring his words. "What have you got hiding under that veil, Maddox?" Before Colt could fully step in, the drunk's hand reached out toward the veil. Not with desire, with mockery. Like it was some kind of joke he thought he was allowed to make. Colt's blow was sharp. Not hard, just exact. It slammed the man back against the post. The air shot from his lungs in one stunned breath. He didn't draw his gun, didn't shout. Just stepped close enough that the message wouldn't need repeating. "Don't look at her again," Colt muttered, his voice splintered inside. "Ever." The man dropped to his knees, coughing. Others gathered, not to help, just to watch, to burn into memory what they'd just seen. Someone whispered, "Has he lost his damn mind?" Another said, "Brought ruin to his own house." The words spread like thorns. The cursed squaw, the ruined rancher, the madman who walked out of the fire. None of it was new, but this time it felt different. Colt saw it in their eyes. It wasn't just rejection now, it was fear, hiding behind contempt. Fear looking for an excuse. The ride home was quiet, but not like before. This time, fear rode with them. In the saddle, in the wind, in every thought. She said nothing. But Colt saw her grip the reins tighter, like someone bracing for what was coming. He kept his eyes forward. He knew how towns worked. Knew that once folks decided you were marked, they'd always find a way to make you pay. By the time they reached the ranch, there was no relief. Just the solid truth that the storm had already given them its name. That night, the silence felt different. More fragile. More real. Like both of them understood something had broken out there. And there was no stopping what was coming. That night, after the incident in town, the silence inside the ranch wasn't the same as before. It wasn't tension, wasn't immediate fear. It was something thinner, like a fresh crack, spreading slow. Something both of them could feel, but didn't know how to name. Colt lit the kitchen fire with clumsy hands, moved the pot like he'd forgotten its weight. He tripped on a loose rope, and a hook slipped loose. The iron fell with a hard clang, kicking up a cloud of ash that coated his boots and half his pant leg. He stood still, staring at the mess, then let out a sigh. Not angry, just worn out. The kind that doesn't come from the chest, but from the soul. Then something happened. Something small. A short sound, half swallowed. A kind of muffled laugh escaped from the corner of the room. He looked up. She had covered her mouth with her hand, like she'd surprised even herself, like she'd broken some rule no one had ever spoken. Her eyes opened slightly, startled, expecting correction or punishment. Colt didn't say a word. He didn't smile either. He just looked at her. No judgment, no shame, no mockery. And in that simple act, just standing still, he made it clear there was nothing to punish. She slowly lowered her hand, still unsure, like the sound might come back and turn on her. She didn't laugh again, but something in her face had shifted, a shade of something, faint, but there. Colt picked the pot off the floor without a word, shook his head slowly, not in anger, just the kind of gesture you make when a day has gone on too long. Then he got back to what he was doing. No apology, no explanation. But in that tiny moment, something settled between them. Not trust, not tenderness, but a human gesture. And in the desert of that life, that was already a lot. The real conversation came later, when night had settled in full and the ranch felt smaller, like the wind wanted to come inside and listen. Colt sat by the fire, fidgeting with an old buckle that didn't need fixing, just something to keep in his hands. She appeared at the doorway without a sound, hesitated, then stepped through and sat across from him, without the veil, at just the right distance, not too near, not too far. The firelight touched her face from the side. Didn't hide it. Didn't light it up fully either. Just enough. Like even the night knew there was no need to see more than what mattered. The fire happened at night, she said softly, her voice steady, like it was a story she'd told herself for years, but never out loud. Colt didn't interrupt. He only looked up. It started in the kitchen, she said. No one noticed until it was too late. My mother was inside. I ran to get her out. Someone pushed me from behind. The roof came down. The heat tore the skin right off me. She wasn't looking for pity. She wasn't speaking to heal. She was just giving a name to something that had never been said out loud. When I woke up, she continued, there was no one left. Silence filled the room. But this time, it didn't feel heavy. It felt like space. Colt set the buckle down on the table, rubbed his face, like exhaustion had finally caught up with him all at once. Something similar happened at my ranch, he said, voice rough. Just a spark. No one knows how it started. The barn went up in minutes. He told just enough. About the partner who never made it out. The promises made near the corral. How folks didn't blame him, but never looked at him the same again. Ever since then, he added, they look at me like I'm carrying something you can't see, but it still burns. She didn't look away, not with pity, but with understanding. She didn't interrupt, didn't add anything. We survived, she said at last, like the word itself tasted bitter. Colt nodded. There was no comfort in that phrase, just truth. They stayed like that a while, sharing the kind of silence that comes when there's nothing left to hide. They were no longer just a forced bargain or a shared burden. They were two people who'd walked through fire, who came out marked, but still standing. When she stood to return to her room, Colt didn't move, didn't follow, didn't stop her. He just watched her go, knowing something had shifted, not outwardly, but underneath, like the way some things change not because they break, but because they settle into a new shape. That night, they slept under the same roof like always. But for the first time, neither one was entirely alone. It wasn't long after that night of spoken words. The ranch returned to its fragile rhythm. Dust, scrawny cattle, and a well that still came up empty. But something had changed, even if neither of them said it. Colt noticed it in small things, details that once meant nothing but now kept repeating. Riders passing slower by the fence, eyes that didn't look away when he glanced up. Conversations that stopped mid-sentence when he stepped into town. Rumors, once like ash in the wind, were taking shape, gaining voice, gaining weight. One afternoon, while he was latching the chicken yard gate, he saw lights moving out near the edge of the main road. They weren't travelers or herders. They stopped at certain points, men measuring land, watching. The next day, a neighbor, neither friend nor enemy, spoke to him plainly. "They're meeting up, some of the ranchers, armed, at night. Word is, we need to protect ourselves before it's too late." Colt didn't answer. He didn't need to. The man added, "That woman, she didn't come alone. No one ever does from that side. You know how it works. The word spy is already being tossed around. Won't be long till it reaches the other side of the valley." Colt swallowed. Not from fear, from anger held in check. He knew arguing wouldn't help, not when fear had already picked its story. Back at the ranch, she felt it too. She read it in his eyes, in his silences, in the invisible signs that always come before a storm. She began covering her face again, even indoors, moved more cautiously. Sometimes she stood for long stretches staring toward the hills, like she could feel her people out there, though no trace showed. One evening, Colt found fresh boot prints near the dry creek. Not from cattle, from boots, many of them, and they made no attempt to hide. The message was clear. They were being watched. And someone wanted him to know it. As if that wasn't enough, pressure started to build from the other side too. A messenger showed up near the border of Apache territory. He wasn't armed, but he wasn't unprotected either. Young, stern, with the eyes of someone who didn't come to negotiate. He asked to speak with Colt. Alone. It wasn't a direct threat. It was something worse. A warning, wrapped in careful words. The chief, Thorn Redhawk, expected Colt to hold up his end of the bargain, to keep his daughter under his roof, not to hide her, not to send her back, because her presence, alive and visible, was still the only thread holding together a balance already broken. Not because of her, but because of what she represented. Colt understood it then, with the same clarity a man feels heat just before the fire breaks out. She wasn't just a woman caught between two worlds. She was a piece placed in the center of a game no one had asked her to play. To the ranchers, she was the perfect excuse. Fear with a face. To her father, she was the last promise of time. And to Colt, she was both at once. That night, while he barred the doors and checked his rifle, Colt finally admitted what he'd been trying not to face. They weren't just caught in the middle of a problem. They were trapped inside something that was going to explode, and this time, there'd be no place to hide. She slept uneasy, body tense even under the covers. Colt watched from the doorway. He didn't wake her, didn't go near, but he knew. If someone knocked right then, demanding what they thought was theirs, he wouldn't hand her over, not to the chief, not to the townsfolk, not to anyone. The land no longer slept easy. The nights were growing shorter, hotter, like the heat wasn't coming from the sun, but from something boiling beneath the soil. Colt saw it in the animals, pacing restless with no direction. In the firewood that snapped louder than it should, in the wind that carried stillness instead of relief, and most of all, in her, Rhea. Colt called her that now in his mind, though never out loud. Saying her name felt like crossing into something sacred or dangerous. But the truth was, for days now, her breath had grown shallower at night, her movements sharper, her eyes more distant. Something inside her was stirring too. Something old, something that had slept, and was now waking with the same slow dread as misfortune. One night, the wind brought a smell that didn't belong. Not manure. Not old wood, something sharper, dirtier, a scent they both knew too well. Colt bolted upright, stepped out onto the porch, rifle in hand, jaw locked tight. The sky was black, but off in the distance, a flickering orange glow danced through the trees. Fire. Not on his ranch, but close. Too close. Rhea was already standing. She didn't ask. Her eyes were open, but they didn't see. One hand clutched her chest, the other her throat, like she couldn't find air. She took a step back. Then another. Stumbled into the table and dropped to her knees without a sound. Colt found her there, gasping for breath, frozen in a place that wasn't this one, but the one with the old flames. "Rhea," he said, speaking her name aloud for the first time. She didn't react. He knelt beside her, slow and careful, as if getting too close might shatter something he couldn't see. His hand touched her shoulder. She was trembling, but didn't flinch. "You're not there," he whispered. Not anymore, but her eyes were far away. Crossing time. Back in the smoke, in the crackling timber, in the screams the wind never managed to carry away. Colt didn't know how to reach her, not with words. So he did the only thing he could. He stood up, took one step between her and the door, another between her and the firelight glowing out there in the trees. And there he stayed, silent, like a shield, like a vow without words. She saw him then, not with her eyes, but with some other part of herself. The part that still knew how to recognize a shadow not come to destroy her, but to shield her. And in that gesture, as simple as him just standing there, she understood he wasn't going to leave. Minutes passed. Long. Harsh. Until her breathing found its rhythm again. Until her hands stopped clawing at the ground like it might open beneath her. Then she stood up. Without help. Brushed the dust off her knees. Didn't say thank you. She didn't need to. Colt nodded slowly. He didn't move. Didn't go to her. Didn't ask if she was all right. He just offered her a steady silence. And that was enough. That night, the fire never reached the ranch. It burned out in the dry brush of some neighbor's field. But the glow stayed etched in the windows, like a warning left behind. The next day, Rhea didn't bring it up. But something in the way she moved had shifted. No more short steps. No more downcast eyes. She kept working, like always. But now there was something new in her posture. A quiet, gentle uprightness that only comes to those who've walked through hell and dared to look back. Colt noticed. But he didn't say a word. Later that afternoon, while they were fixing the broken fence, she came up beside him without a sound. She stopped at his side. He looked at her, expecting the usual practical remark. But what she said unraveled him. "Thank you," she murmured, barely moving her lips. Then she added, "Not for last night, for staying." Colt swallowed hard, took off his hat, held it in both hands for a moment, then gave a single nod. No more, no less. That day, when the sun went down, it didn't go alone. And though the tension still lingered in the air, like a crouched animal waiting for its moment, they both knew that whatever came next, They were no longer standing alone before the fire of the world. The calm after the fire isn't true calm. It's just a pause, where all that has burned tries to find a place to settle. The days that followed were filled with a gentle silence. Colt worked with his head low, not expecting the ranch to flourish or the cattle to fatten. Rhea went about her routine, sweeping, washing, cooking. But now her movements weren't just habit. They were presence. She no longer kept to the corners. She no longer avoided Colt's gaze. And when they crossed paths, there was no shame. Only that strange kind of respect shared between two people who've seen the other burn from the inside and didn't run. One night, the wind blew in from the east, carrying dust and the dry scent of scorched earth. The ranch was quiet. The crickets sang, but softer than usual. Colt couldn't sleep. He sat at the edge of the bed, barefoot, hands clasped, staring at the wooden floorboards like maybe some answer was carved into them. He thought about all the things he didn't understand, about how this woman, with scars outside and in, had come to fill a space he hadn't even realized was still empty. It wasn't desire, it wasn't guilt either. It was something else. Simpler, deeper, respect, admiration, shared silence. A soft sound pulled him out of the thought. The door opened, slow. Rhea stood there, back straight, arms at her sides. No veil, no fear. Head held high, but not in defiance. Colt stood slowly, took a step toward her. He didn't ask why she was there, didn't make a move, just looked at her. She held his gaze, then said in a low voice, steady, plain, without decoration, "It's not because of the agreement." A pause. "It's not about what they owe you, or what I owe." Another pause. "Because I want to." Just like that. Nothing more. And then, without asking permission, she stepped toward him and laid her hand on his chest. Right there, where the heart tends to make the most noise on nights like that. Colt swallowed. Not from nerves, from the flood of something he didn't have a name for. But that felt a lot like what ranch folk call clean will. The kind you don't force, don't demand, just offer. They didn't kiss with urgency. There were no desperate hands. They just looked at each other like two people finally recognizing themselves in someone else's eyes. And that night, for the first time, they shared the same room, the same bed, the same breath. No big words were spoken, no promises made, but none were needed. Dawn came slow, painting the roof slats with warm orange. Rhea slept peacefully, no tension in her brow. Colt, already awake, watched her with a mix of calm and caution. He knew this wasn't a victory, not a happy ending. He knew the world outside hadn't changed, that the town would still whisper, that the Apache were still watching from a distance, and that the dry land had no plans to show mercy. But something had changed, because the woman who hadn't been chosen, but handed over, was now choosing for herself. And so was he. Later that day, when Rhea stepped out into the yard, barefoot, head uncovered, Roy watched her from the barn. He didn't say anything, but he understood. Dax, on the other hand, spat at the ground, twisted his mouth, and went back inside the shed. Life didn't pause. Chores carried on. But something in the air was no longer the same. And though they had no guarantees, no escape plan, they both knew that not all was lost. As long as they could look each other in the eye and say, even in silence, "I choose to stay." That was the only promise they made that day. And the only one that meant anything in a world where words no longer held weight. Dawn came with a new scent. It wasn't smoke, it wasn't dust, it was gunpowder. Faint but unmistakable. Colt recognized it instantly. It was a scent you never forget. It sinks into your blood, settles at the base of your neck. Doesn't matter how long it's been since you last fired a round. Gunpowder always comes back. That morning, up on the North Ridge, riders appeared. They didn't come down, just lingered. Like wolves before a leap. Roy had seen them first. He was eating breakfast with his feet kicked up and his hat over his face when he spotted them through the haze. "Those ain't traitors," he said, dry as dust. Dax nodded, loading his rifle without a word. Colt stepped onto the porch, scanning the horizon. No doubt about it. They weren't soldiers, but they rode like men who knew what they were doing, and they were armed. They hadn't come to talk. They came to gauge distance, to send a message. Rhea watched from the window, said nothing. Her eyes held no fear, no surrender, just something far more dangerous. The acceptance that anything built in silence can be shattered in a single shot. By noon, confirmation arrived. A lone rider, young in a faded uniform, wearing the look of someone who didn't want to be there, came up the main road. Colt went to meet him, hands empty but gaze sharp. The boy didn't dismount. He pulled out a wrinkled piece of paper and read it without meeting Colt's eyes. By order of the Rural Defense Committee of Cross Ridge County, any individual considered a threat to neighborhood peace is hereby requested to vacate the premises. He paused. He looked at Colt, then at the house. The woman must be turned over before sunrise on Monday for preventive custody. Preventive custody. 2 words wrapped in lies. Both of them knew it. Colt didn't answer, didn't curse, didn't spit. He just raised his eyes to the boy and said, "Tell your committee, if they want to talk to me, they'd best come with their faces showing." The boy swallowed, turned his horse, and rode off without another word. That night, the ranch was more alive than ever. Not in celebration. In preparation. Dax cleaned the rifles. Roy sharpened the stable blades. Rhea sewed up an old blanket with thick thread, never saying what it was for. Colt checked every beam, every window, every lock. They didn't know if the storm would arrive by dawn, the next day, or a week later. But they knew it would arrive. On the other side, tension rose too. The Apache Council was displeased. Agreements didn't hold themselves, and Colt, without meaning to, was no longer just a man with a woman. He was now a breaking point, a crack between 2 lands already fractured long before. A new messenger came on foot, this one older, skin weathered by time and failed treaties. "Chief Redhawk has not forgotten his word," he said, voice slow. "But the people no longer listen to chiefs." Colt understood. It wasn't enough to keep a promise. Now he had to choose. "If she returns," the elder added, "maybe we avoid bloodshed. Maybe we buy time. Maybe." Another word worth nothing. Colt took a long breath. "She's not going anywhere," he said, eyes fixed on the horizon. The old man nodded, not with approval, with resignation. "Then protect your home well." And he walked away. That night, Rhea stepped into the barn and found Colt building barricades. She said nothing. Neither did he. But when their eyes met, they both knew. The inevitable was already walking toward them, and when it knocked, they would have to answer. Not with words, but with all they were, and all that might remain. Dawn came without the rooster's call. The sky was a dull line between gray and red, the kind of morning that smells like gunpowder even before a shot is fired. No one at the ranch ate. No one lit the fire. Only Colt, quietly, sharpened the old shovel, more out of habit than hope. Roy loaded his revolver like a man who doesn't want to use it but knows he will. Dax shut the windows, tied the knots tighter, sealed the doors. Every step echoed like war drums in a house that was no longer a home, but a trench. And Rhea stood in the center of the yard, back straight, hair loose, face uncovered. She didn't hide. She didn't explain herself. She didn't ask forgiveness. Colt watched her from the porch. "You could leave now," he said. "No one would follow. You could disappear among your own before they arrive." She shook her head. "I left once, but I didn't leave free. This time, I am." Colt swallowed hard. His heart felt heavy as an anvil, and for the first time since all this began, his voice trembled. "I don't want to lose you." She stepped toward him, touched his face with a tenderness that didn't seem possible on such dry ground. "You haven't lost me," she said. "I'm right here." And that was all. No vow, no kiss, just presence. The first gunshot came at noon. It wasn't aimed at the ranch. It was fired into the air, a warning, a signal. Colt walked out with his rifle loaded, but not raised. Roy and Dax flanked him, Rhea behind them, steady as a stone tower. Across the dust stood a group of mounted men, uniforms mixed with farmers' hats. Some were neighbors, others were strangers, all of them armed. The spokesman dismounted. He had the face of a judge, but the voice of an executioner. "We came for the woman. It's not personal." Colt met his eyes. "Everything that crosses this gate is personal." The man sighed, took a step forward. "We don't want bloodshed, just trying to stop more of it. Hand over the squaw, and this ends today." Silence. Colt clenched his jaw, finger on the trigger, heart pounding, not from rage, but from certainty. "No one gets handed over here," he said. "Here, we choose who we die with." Rhea stepped forward and stood beside him. Not behind. Beside. The man frowned. "You don't get it, Maddox. It's not about her. You're the problem. You're the one who brought the crack." "Then pull the trigger," Colt replied. "But don't say it's for the greater good. Don't use those words. There's no greater good here, only fear." A murmur rippled through the group. No one fired. No one moved. The spokesman stayed frozen. Rhea lifted her chin. "If I die today, I'll do it standing, and looking the shooter straight in the eye." And that was the moment, the longest, the tightest, the one where everything could have broken. But it didn't. Because no one had the courage to be the first to kill someone who refused to look away. One by one, the men began to retreat. Not because they were convinced, but because they understood there's no victory worth having when it comes without a soul. The spokesman was the last to mount up. "This isn't over." Colt looked at him with sadness. "No, it's not over. But today, you didn't kill anyone." When the dust settled and the hoofbeats faded into the hills, the ranch fell silent. But it was a different silence. Not one of fear. One of life. Roy slumped on the porch, exhausted. Dax took off his hat and spit into the dirt. Rhea stepped inside the house without hurry. Colt stayed outside, watching the horizon. The sky was clear. No smoke, for now, and he thought, not aloud, but deep in his bones. What do you win when you choose to protect the one the world wants to see fall? Maybe the answer didn't matter. Maybe the only thing left was to choose not to walk away. Not ever again. And you? What would you do if the only thing left to save was the one everyone else had already given up on? If this story moved you, we invite you to journey with us through more true tales of the Old West. Stories that honor resilience, tenderness, and the spirit God placed in those who carved a path across untamed land. Subscribe, share, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Join us once again as we walk the trails of this wild, sacred land. Thank you.